Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight. Let's get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare to drift into a world long before our own. Imagine a time untouched by clocks, deadlines, or the mechanical hum of modern life. Instead, you hear the soft crackle of a fire, the wind rustling through tall grass, and the gentle murmurs of a family huddled together beneath a rocky overhang. In this story, we explore not the warriors or the hunters, but the often unseen, yet deeply significant daily lives of the cavewomen. What did they do all day? Were they merely background characters to the more glorified male hunters? Or did their days weave the very fabric of early human survival? In this story, you'll find that life in the Paleolithic age was neither simple nor static. It was vivid, emotional, communal, and surprisingly familiar. So now, let's dim the lights of the mind and step softly into the shadowy past. The sky that morning was overcast, though to them it was simply another kind of light, pale blue and dappled with white streaks filtered by the clouds. The ground was soft with last night's rain. A woman, tall for her people, knelt just outside the stone ledge of their family shelter. Her name, though unspoken by any of us, was something like Aluna, a sound that rolled like water and wind. She was scraping fur from a deer hide using a blade chipped from dark flint, and her hands moved with a rhythm so practiced, she could do it with her eyes closed. She had done it every day of her adult life. Around her, other women sat in a rough half circle. One hummed gently, while threading animal sinew through a net of woven reeds, crafting a cradle for a baby yet to be born. Another, older and wrapped in a fur cloak despite the mildness of the day, inspected the toe of a child who had scraped it on a sharp stone. With a slow patience, she rubbed ash and a paste of herbs onto the wound, whispering what might have been a lullaby or a prayer. Cave women, you see, were rarely idle. Their work was constant, woven into the natural rhythms of the day. They were makers of things and healers of wounds, but above all, they were the keepers of continuity. Their labor, soft-footed and unsung, kept their families alive not just in body, but in spirit. Aluna had 3 children. The youngest, still at her breast, lay bundled in a moss-lined wrap that clung to her side as she worked. The eldest, a boy of maybe 7, was darting between rocks chasing a beetle, his hair matted and his knees muddy. The middle child, a girl named Tia, was sitting beside her mother, watching her hands work the hide with silent reverence. Someday, not long from now, she would scrape her own hides. For now, she watched and learned. Farther up the slope, past a small stand of trees, another pair of women knelt near a stream. One held a wooden bowl filled with soaked roots, while the other pounded them gently with a round stone. From time to time, they would taste the paste and nod, adjusting the consistency with practiced touches. The roots were bitter but nourishing, and today they were meant for an elder who hadn't been able to eat for days. Though there were no written records, no scribes or storytellers with quills, knowledge passed through the hands and voices of women. They whispered recipes, showed gestures, traded plant lore like precious stones. In that silence, a rich network of knowing grew, invisible to the eye but deeply felt. Back in the shelter, the scent of the previous night's fire lingered. The fire pit, ringed with stone, still held some warmth. An older woman, perhaps the oldest in their clan, sat cross-legged beside it, carving patterns into a piece of antler. Her face was lined with many winters, and her gaze was distant. Some said the carvings were messages, others said they were memories. She had once been the one to grind the roots, to birth the babies, to stitch the hides. Now, her value lay in her stories. When she spoke, everyone listened. Aluna glanced toward the sky, estimating the time by the angle of the light. She murmured to Tia, and the girl scampered off into the woods with another child to collect kindling. They would be gone a while. She turned her attention back to the hide, now soft and pliable, ready to be sewn into a tunic or a blanket. Each task had its time. Morning was for preparation, tools, food, fire. Midday brought teaching and storytelling, time with the children. Afternoons were filled with gathering or butchering or foraging, and always someone watched the little ones. There were no babysitters, but there were many mothers, and care was a collective act. This particular day, the wind picked up. It carried the scent of wild garlic and distant smoke, a signal. The hunters might be returning. Not just men, but some women too. Strong ones, quiet and observant, skilled with snares or slingstones. Not all women stayed at the shelter, and not all men hunted. Roles flowed like the river, changing with seasons, health, and need. Aluna's sister Mia was among the foragers. She'd left at dawn with a woven pouch and a bone-handled knife. She was lean and fast, often returning with rare fungi, bird eggs, or sweet honey scraped from hollowed bark. Today, Aluna felt uneasy. It was the kind of quiet that settled into your chest before something went wrong. She glanced toward the path leading through the hills, but before she could dwell on it, her youngest stirred. She reached down, lifted the baby into her lap, and continued to scrape the hide with one hand while bouncing the child with the other. Her arms were strong, her touch gentle. In that moment, she was not just a provider, but a cradle, a teacher, and a home. From the slope, a shriek, then laughter. Tia had tripped but was fine. Another day, another bruise. Aluna smiled faintly and exhaled. You see, their days were not marked by hours but by happenings. The first light, the return of birds, the rustle of grass underfoot. The tasks they completed were never truly done, and yet they moved through them with grace and repetition. Each stitch in the hide, each crushed leaf, was part of a story older than language. As the sun climbed and the air warmed, the camp shifted again. Children dozed, women gathered, the older ones murmured. Aluna sat back and looked at her hands, stained with work. There was always more to do. But for now she listened to the trees, the wind, the breath of her child, and the silent song of a world that remembered itself through her. And so their days flowed like rivers, wide, quiet, and full of hidden depth. The morning slowly gave way to midday, and the sun hung high, though softened by the gentle veil of thin clouds. The light filtered down in dappled flecks, illuminating patches of moss and stone in a quiet shimmer. Aluna moved from her place near the fire pit, her legs slightly stiff from the hours of crouching. She stretched, her back arching, arms high above her head, and let out a slow, full breath. Around her, the others shifted their rhythms too, as the camp entered the lull of midday, neither rest nor rush, but a kind of suspended breath between exertion and preparation. Mia had not yet returned. This absence lingered at the edge of Aluna's thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't quite fall away. The foraging paths were many and curved through thickets and gullies, some far-reaching. Mia was experienced and rarely delayed, but the forest could be unpredictable. A sudden slip on wet stone, a broken branch, the growl of something too close. Still, Aluna knew that fear was an old animal that often barked louder than it bit. She busied her hands again, this time with a strip of softened hide, beginning the careful act of folding and binding it into a carrying pouch. The sinew thread had to be dampened just so, the holes punched with a pointed awl of bone, each stitch pulled with firm yet forgiving hands. Tia had returned and was now mimicking the motion beside her mother, using scraps from the cutoffs. Her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration. Her hands trembled slightly with effort. Across the clearing, the older women gathered to share a meal of softened tubers and shredded meat from the previous hunt. The meat had been smoked, a rare indulgence when weather allowed, and a sure sign they had gathered in this place for more than a few days. Their life was not strictly nomadic nor sedentary. It followed the pull of season, of prey, of shelter. When the cave offered protection from wind and the surrounding bore enough to sustain them, they stayed, but never for too long. The land, like time, demanded movement. Tia tugged at her thread too hard and snapped it. Aluna leaned over, murmuring gently, not a scold, but a suggestion. She showed her how to dampen the sinew again, how not to twist it too tightly. Tia nodded and tried once more, her fingers already more sure. The wind shifted again. This time it brought something heavier, more pungent, the unmistakable scent of blood, iron and warmth and damp fur. From beyond the trees, a call, low and rhythmic. Not an alarm, but a signal. The hunters had returned. The camp roused. Not with frantic motion, but with a quiet gathering, like birds drawing into the nest. Aluna rose, her knees dusted with ochre and earth, and handed the pouch to Tia to finish. She moved toward the slope where the trees parted, eyes narrowing against the glare. First came two boys, barely older than her son, each dragging a pole laden with small birds. Their faces were flushed with pride. Then followed a man and a woman, Naru and Sali, carrying between them a makeshift sled made of interwoven branches. On it, the bulk of a deer, its legs limp, eyes glassy. Blood trickled down one side, soaking into the woven mat, but Mia was not among them. Aluna's stomach clenched, but she said nothing. She moved to the edge of the group as they entered the clearing. The hunters did not speak immediately. First came ritual, the laying down of the prey, the rubbing of ash on the animal's forehead, a quiet thanks spoken in grunts and hums. Then came the gathering, those tasked with butchering already taking up their tools. The children were ushered back, save for the older ones who would assist or watch. Naru approached Aluna, his eyes searching hers. He did not smile. Mia stayed back, he said simply. She cut her leg crossing the ravine. Aluna inhaled sharply, but kept her tone calm. Is she safe? She is resting. I left her food. She said she'd follow when the bleeding slowed. She wouldn't let us wait. That sounded like Mia. Still, Aluna turned away, already gathering a pouch of salves and a water skin. The act of preparing steadied her hands. The old woman, the one with the carved antler, rose and stepped forward, placing a hand on Aluna's shoulder. It was neither permission nor denial, but something like acknowledgement. Aluna nodded, passed the baby to a cousin, and set off. The woods beyond the clearing were dense but familiar. Aluna moved quickly, feet barely disturbing the undergrowth. Every snapped twig and parted leaf was a trail marker. She hummed low, a sound Mia would know. A sound that had no meaning except to say, I am here, I am coming. She found Mia by the creek, sitting against a large stone. Her leg was propped on a mossy log, wrapped in a bundle of soaked fibers. She looked pale, but her eyes were alert. You stubborn fool, Aluna muttered, kneeling beside her. Mia chuckled weakly. I slipped on the roots, tried to make it across. The water was high. Aluna unwrapped the makeshift dressing. The wound was deep, more than a scrape, but not fatal. She cleaned it slowly, using water warmed in the pouch against her chest. Then she smeared a mixture of honey and crushed leaves across the torn skin, pressing a clean wrap tightly around it. Mia hissed, but didn't move. They sat together for a while, silent except for the rustling of trees above them. Do you remember when we got lost in the lowlands? Mia asked, eyes half closed. You were 7. I was 10, Aluna replied. You chased a bird, and I followed you. We cried all night. We found that old fox den, and you swore it was a spirit cave. Mia smiled faintly. I still think it was. Aluna stood and helped her sister to her feet. They would move slowly. It didn't matter. The camp would wait. They always did. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trees, the sisters made their way home. One limping, the other steady, both strong. The path back was quiet, but their hearts were full of memory, pain, and the strange, soft courage that came not from glory, but from care. Back in the clearing, the fire crackled anew, and children's laughter rose with the smoke. The deer was already being portioned, its bones cracked and marrow drawn. Hands worked quickly, voices low, the cycle continuing. In this world, nothing stopped, but everything matter drawn. By the time Aluna and Mia emerged from the woods, dusk had softened the camp into a hush. The fire's orange glow flickered on the walls of the shallow cave and cast long shadows across the clearing. The scent of roasted meat lingered in the air, mixing with damp earth and crushed grass beneath tired feet. Children had settled into loose bundles of fur and moss, some already asleep, others whispering softly with wide, blinking eyes. The women greeted them silently. Sally brought a carved bowl of broth and passed it into Aluna's hands without a word. Mia was helped to the fire's edge, where the older woman, keeper of stories and wounds alike, checked the dressing without comment, only nodding once with approval before handing her a warm stone wrapped in skin. Mia pressed it to her stomach and leaned back, eyes fluttering closed. Her face, lined with exhaustion, bore a peace that only returned when you were once again among your people. Aluna took the bowl and moved to the other side of the fire. She sat with her legs folded beneath her, the warmth spreading into her bones. Around her, the quiet murmur of the group rose and fell like breath. Small conversations sparked here and there, about the meat, the trail, the coming change in the wind, but they floated softly, as if not to disturb the sleep that clung to the edges of everyone's eyes. The night was a tapestry. Above, the stars began to pierce the sky, sharp and bright. There was no need to name them, they simply were, constant, eternal, whispering stories that only the oldest remembered, stories that passed not through language, but through gesture and gaze, and the way the firelight danced on the faces of those who watched. It was in this hour, the twilight between day and full dark, that the stories came. The elder woman cleared her throat and the murmur quieted. She held the carved antler still in her lap, her fingers brushing across its smooth grooves. Her eyes, foggy but far-seeing, scanned the gathered group. She began to hum, low and slow, like the first rolling echo in a deep cave. The children turned to her, wide-eyed. Even the youngest stirred at the sound. She spoke in rhythms, not fast, not slow, just enough to lull the body while stirring the mind. Her voice carried memory, and in that voice, the cave transformed. She told of the woman who walked with wolves, who it was said could lie beside them and speak their names, who brought them meat, and in return they warned her of danger with howls that echoed across the plains. This woman had lived long ago, but still, her name hummed beneath the wind. Taya curled closer to her mother, fingers wrapped in Aluna's skirt. The little girl's eyes were fixed on the old woman, her breath shallow with attention. Then came the tale of the firebringer, a woman struck by lightning on a hill, who survived, her hair forever white, her hands forever warm. It was said she could call fire with her breath, and that wherever she slept, embers would rise by morning. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was the beginning of every fire since. The children's eyes gleamed. Even the men listened, their mouths stilling mid-bite. Because though the day was ruled by action, the night belonged to remembering. As the story wound down, the old woman paused. She looked across the fire directly at Aluna. "There is a story I have not yet told," she said. Aluna blinked, startled to find herself the subject of the fire's gaze. The old woman pointed a crooked finger. "The woman who sees paths where none exist. She is not old, not yet, but she carries the memory of those who were." Her voice deepened. "She walks between the trees with her ears open, and the land speaks back. She touches the wound and feels where the blood hides. She speaks no spell, but her hands carry quiet magic." Aluna looked down, uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. But Tia sat up straighter, proud. To her, the words were not strange, they were simply true. The night thickened. One by one, people drifted into sleep. Some curled alone beneath hides, others in clumps of arms and knees and dreams. The fire sank lower, pulsing gently, breathing in the silence. Aluna remained awake. She watched the flames for a long time. The stories had stirred something in her. Not fear, not pride, but a soft ache. A pull towards something she could not yet name. The woods had always spoken to her. The roots, the streams, the bones of the earth. They had rhythms she could feel. But tonight, under the weight of the story, she wondered whether others felt it too, or if she walked alone along those hidden paths. The stars turned slowly. Somewhere an owl called. A distant crack of a branch echoed, then stilled. She laid down beside her children, pulling a woven wrap across their small bodies. Tia murmured in her sleep, something about wolves and fire. Aluna brushed a hand across her daughter's forehead and whispered nothing, just breath and presence and warmth. The moon rose high, and in the silence the women dreamed, not of battles or beasts, but of weaving, of growing things, of old songs hummed into the sky, dreams stitched from memory, fear, and quiet power. In the world of the cave, where time flowed without measure and each day echoed the last in both rhythm and difference, the night was sacred, not because of what it hid, but because of what it revealed. The fire dimmed, the breath of the earth slowed, and in the hearts of its quietest keepers, stories curled like smoke into the stars. The morning returned not with a trumpet call, but with dew. It clung to the grass like tiny breaths from the earth, soft and cold against bare ankles. Birds called lazily from the trees, their voices scattered like forgotten dreams. Smoke still curled upward from the fire pit's last glowing coals, rising in pale ribbons into the new light. Aluna stirred before the others. It was always this way. The stillness of dawn called to her more than the warmth of rest. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Tia, who had shifted during the night and now lay sprawled like a pup across the furs. The baby nestled against her side, let out a small sigh, but did not wake. Aluna wrapped herself in a fur cloak, stepped lightly across the stones, and made her way down to the stream. Mist hovered above the water, casting a ghostly shimmer across its surface. Her reflection was vague, like a shadow made of fog and motion. She knelt, cupped the cold water to her lips, and drank deeply. The chill shocked her awake in the gentlest way. Around her, the forest exhaled. It was during these hours, before the clamor of voices, before chores began, that Aluna let her thoughts unfold. Not in words, they were unnecessary, but in a quiet, rhythmic feeling that moved through her limbs and breath like a low drumbeat. She stood and walked upstream, her feet following the familiar path. The stones were slick, the moss thick beneath her soles. She reached the fallen tree where she often sat and paused, touching its gnarled bark. Years ago, before Tia was born, she had watched a fox raise her kits beneath its hollow. The fox was long gone, but Aluna still returned, drawn by the memory. Settling onto the trunk, she closed her eyes and listened. The stream whispered of motion, of flow and stone, of fish darting beneath the surface. The trees creaked gently above. Somewhere in the canopy, a squirrel scolded no one in particular, and deeper still, beneath all the noise, was the quiet hum of being. A song without melody, but not without meaning. A faint crunch of footsteps interrupted her reverie. She turned her head slightly, already knowing who it would be. Sally approached with careful steps, her arms wrapped tight against the morning chill. "You always come here," Sally said, not as a question. Aluna nodded. "The water speaks better than people do at this hour." Sally gave a small smile and joined her on the log. They sat in silence for a while, each woman wrapped in her own layer of thought. Sally was a few winters younger, but carried herself with a steadiness that belied her age. She was one of the few who hunted regularly with the men, not because she sought it, but because she moved quietly and struck clean. "I dreamed of a storm last night," Sally said suddenly. "Not here, but somewhere far, the kind that splits trees and darkens the sky. I was walking through it barefoot, and the rain burned." Aluna looked at her, eyebrows raised. "I think it's coming," Sally continued. "Not the dream, but something like it." Aluna considered this. Dreams were not idle in their world. They moved through the body like omens, often unclear but rarely without weight. "Was the fire out when you woke?" Aluna asked. Sally nodded. "Just smoke. I had to stir the coals." "Then something is shifting." They sat longer, watching the stream. The sun had risen now, and the mist was pulling back, revealing more of the world with each passing breath. Birds flitted through the branches, the leaves catching gold where once they held gray. Back at the camp, movement had begun. Children's voices rose like flocks of sparrows, quick and chaotic, the sounds of scraping, splitting, stirring. Another day, another thread in the long weave. Aluna and Sally returned together, walking quietly through the undergrowth. When they stepped into the clearing, Mia was already awake, her leg bandaged and propped on a smooth stone, a child helping her crush dried roots with a flat rock. Tia ran to her mother and hugged her leg without words. Aluna bent to kiss the top of her head. Tasks began as they always did, but today with a deeper sense of presence. A new snare was needed, so the girls gathered reeds and stripped bark. The older boys sharpened stakes for the cooking pit. Mia instructed them from her seat, gesturing with the authority of one who had done the work 100 times. But it was not just the chores that filled the day. It was the stories behind the chores. Each tool had a story. The basket had been woven during a long drought. The fire pit stone was carried from another camp miles away by a woman now gone. Even the flint blades had lineage, their edges sharpened by hands whose bones now rested beneath cairns of river stones. In the late afternoon, Tia came to Aluna with a handful of broken shells. She had found them near the water, bright and pink and weathered. Her eyes sparkled. "Can we make something?" she asked. Aluna took the shells and examined them. Some had holes already, worn by time. She smiled and nodded. "A necklace, for your aunt, to thank her." They sat side by side, using bone needles and sinew. Tia threaded the shell slowly, her tongue between her teeth again. With each shell she whispered something, a wish, a word, a memory. Aluna listened without interrupting. When they finished, they brought the necklace to Mia, who touched it to her lips and held it to her heart. Her eyes closed, and for a moment the pain in her leg was forgotten. Tia glowed. This was the true work of the day, not the fire or the meat or the tools, but the acts of care, of attention, of beauty carved from survival. In a world of necessity, ornament was rebellion. It was love. As the sun dipped once more and the shadows stretched long, Aluna felt the shift that Sally had spoken of. Not danger yet, but change. It moved like a low wind beneath the trees, unseen but insistent. She glanced toward the horizon. The clouds were gathering in the distance. Tonight, the fire would need more tending, and the dreams, perhaps, would speak louder. Night descended slowly, with the kind of deliberation that belonged only to the old world. It didn't fall like a curtain. It crept in, like mist through moss, like coolness in the hollows of the rocks. The sounds of the forest shifted. Day birds gave way to night insects, and the gentle crackle of fire resumed its role as the camp's beating heart. Aluna sat beside Mia, gently adjusting the wrap around her leg. The wound looked cleaner now, less red. The herbs had done their work. Mia was drowsy but alert, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing the edge of the necklace Tia had made her. Around the fire, others had gathered again, their movements slower, their eyes heavier. A thin stew bubbled in a pot of hardened clay. Root vegetables, strips of dried meat, crushed leaves for flavor. Tia stirred it under the supervision of the old woman, who watched closely but didn't interfere. This was how learning happened. Not through instruction, but through rhythm, repetition, and presence. The children were quiet tonight. Even the boys, usually tangled in games and whispered battles, sat near their mothers, subdued. Maybe it was the change in the air, or the weight of the dream Sally had spoken of. Maybe they too felt the shift, even if they couldn't name it. From the edge of the clearing, Sally returned, her arms full of dry branches. She set them beside the fire, adding a few to the flames. Sparks leapt up, crackling like laughter too sharp to be joy. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes scanned the dark tree line more than once. Aluna felt it too now, the hush that didn't belong to peace. Not yet fear, but its cousin, a waiting, a listening. The old woman cleared her throat, and all turned to her, but she didn't begin a story. Not right away. Instead, she stared into the fire, her hand resting on the carved antler across her lap. There was a time, she said finally, when the sky turned against us. No one moved. The wind screamed for days. The river swallowed the land. Trees fell not from age, but from fury, and the animals vanished. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried. We had grown careless, she said, forgotten the way we walked. We stopped singing to the trees before we took their bark. We left meat to spoil, forgot to share. The earth noticed. Taya's hand froze on the ladle. But one woman, the elder continued, remembered. She went into the forest alone. She sang the old songs with her feet bare and her heart open. She didn't beg. She didn't weep. She simply remembered. And what happened? Tia asked, barely above a breath. The river receded. The wind gentled. The animals returned. There was silence, thick as wool. Then the stew was ready and bowls were passed around. Small ones for the children, generous ones for the elders. Aluna waited to eat last, as she always did. She took her portion and sat again beside Mia, who accepted a bowl with a quiet nod. Later, after the bowls were emptied and the fire died to a low red glow, Aluna stood and looked toward the edge of the forest. She knew what she had to do. She found a small pouch and filled it with salt, dried root, and a piece of coal from the fire. She wrapped herself in a dark fur cloak and tied a bone pendant around her neck. Tia stirred, watching her mother from the ground. "Where are you going?" she asked, not fearful, curious. "To listen," Aluna said. Then she slipped into the trees. The forest at night was a different being. It breathed deeper, its limbs stretched longer. Aluna walked without light, her feet finding familiar paths. She moved beyond the known, past the berry groves and the moss-covered boulders, farther into the part of the forest where the air felt older. She stopped at a small clearing where moonlight touched a ring of stones. She had been here before, once, as a girl, but never alone. Kneeling, she opened the pouch and placed its contents carefully on the ground. She ground the dried root between her fingers and sprinkled it in a circle. Then she sat, cross-legged, hands open, palms up, and she waited. The wind picked up, not harsh, but insistent. The trees rustled, and in their voices she heard stories, not of people, but of weather, of roots stretching toward water, of foxes running through snow. She whispered, not words, not spells, just sound, a hum, low and steady. Her breath matched the sway of the trees. Her heart slowed, her mind quieted, and in that silence she felt it. Not danger, not yet, but movement. The land was turning like a great body shifting in sleep. Something old was waking, not with malice, but with memory. She opened her eyes and saw that the coal had crumbled to ash, the salt had melted into the soil. The ritual was accepted. Aluna stood slowly, every bone aware of its purpose. She gathered the remnants, turned, and made her way back through the trees. When she returned, the camp was asleep. Only Sally sat awake, her eyes catching the firelight. Aluna met her gaze. No words passed between them. They simply nodded. In the deep of the night, when all else was still, the two women sat by the embers, and the earth breathed with them. By the time first light brushed the tops of the trees with silver, Aluna had already begun her morning motions. Her body moved with the quiet discipline of one who lived by rhythm rather than urgency. She stoked the fire without sound, adding dry twigs collected the night before. Each stick placed with intention. The flames stirred slowly, reluctant at first, then growing bold. A thin mist still clung to the earth, curling around the ankles of those still sleeping. Even the birds were late to rise. The hush had not yet lifted. In that silence, Aluna prepared a bundle. Her day's task lay away from the camp. She would gather clay. It was a task rarely done, but the clan needed it now. Pots were cracking, and the wet season would come soon. They'd need vessels strong enough to carry water and store roots. She bound her hair in a knot behind her head, wrapped a strip of deerskin around each wrist, and slung a woven satchel across her shoulder. The path to the clay beds would take her beyond the ridge, where the land sloped down to a valley of red earth and shallow springs. She had not gone there since the last birth she had attended, nearly 2 seasons ago. As she passed the edge of camp, she paused near Mia, still curled beneath layers of fur. The swelling in her leg had gone down, but the pain had not left. Aluna touched her sister's forehead gently, letting her fingers linger a moment. Mia didn't wake, but her breath deepened as if sensing the farewell. Sally, already sharpening her spear, gave Aluna a small nod from the shadows. It was all the parting that was needed. The forest greeted her with cool air and a silence heavy with dew. Aluna moved with care, her eyes scanning for signs: disturbed underbrush, claw marks on trees, the scattered droppings of deer. The trail was overgrown in places. Roots curled like fingers across the narrow path, and ferns brushed against her legs. As she walked, she sang soft, breathy, barely louder than a whisper. It was an old song, not of words, but of tone. A lullaby to the forest, a way of saying, I am passing through, not taking too much, not meaning harm. The sun climbed slowly, painting the leaves in hues of green and gold. Birds stirred overhead. A squirrel darted across a branch, its tail a banner of movement. Aluna paused once to drink from a narrow stream, cold and sweet. She filled her skin pouch and pressed on. By midday, she reached the clay beds. They stretched along the edge of a shallow, cracked basin where water once pooled. The ground here was a deep rust red, and beneath the surface, a thick vein of grayish-blue clay shimmered in the sunlight. The air smelled of earth and minerals, dense and wet, even in dry heat. Aluna knelt and dug with her hands, feeling for the best texture, smooth, pliable, dense. She moved slowly, carefully, separating good clay from sand and rock. Her satchel filled gradually. She did not rush. The sun watched her from above, silent and steady. After an hour, she sat back and wiped her brow. The wind had picked up slightly, bringing with it a scent she had not expected: smoke. Not the thin, fragrant kind from campfires. This was darker, heavier, old wood, scorched dry. She stood and scanned the horizon. Far off beyond the ridge, a faint smear of gray hung in the air. It drifted upward, as hesitant but present. Aluna narrowed her eyes. That direction held nothing she knew. No other camps, no sacred places, no burn grounds. Still, fire belonged to all things. It was a hunter, a cleanser of spirit. It did not always need reason. She closed her satchel tightly and began the journey back. The walk home felt longer. The forest was still beautiful, unchanged in its shape, but something beneath the canopy had shifted. Birds flew higher, their songs shorter. The wind had a lean to it, a direction that felt deliberate. When Aluna returned to the camp, the fire was lit high and strong. People had gathered already, even the children. Sally was speaking in low tones to Naru, gesturing toward the forest. Her jaw was set, her shoulders tense. Aluna handed the clay bundle to who took it with wide eyes and whispered, "We saw the smoke." She nodded. "It's not near, but it is coming." Sally approached. "We need to scout it. If the wind shifts, we'll smell it stronger tomorrow." Aluna agreed. Take Naru. He moves fast. I will, Sally said, already turning away. As the scouts prepared, the rest of the camp moved with a new urgency. The older children gathered meat into leaf-wrapped bundles. Mothers checked their carrying packs. Even the injured helped. Mia sorted tools, laying them in rows, discarding those beyond use. They had practiced this before, not for fire, but for flood, for predator, for change. That night, the fire was not only warmth, it was signal, a mark of life. It burned tall, defiant, crackling with a voice that dared the dark to speak back. The old woman did not tell a story. She sat in stillness, her hands folded, her gaze distant. Her carved antler lay beside her untouched. Aluna sat beside her family, arms around Tia and the baby, her eyes always scanning the tree line. She felt no fear, only preparation. This was not the first time the land had tested them, and it would not be the last. She whispered the lullaby again, so softly it could barely be heard. The baby sighed in sleep, and in the spaces between the flames, Aluna listened, for crackle, for shift, for the quiet footfall of the next chapter approaching. Dawn arrived behind a veil of smoke. It was thin, just a haze, but it curled low through the branches, clinging to bark, softening the sharp lines of the world. The air smelled of burnt wood and dry leaves, a scent that quickened the pulse even when no flames were yet in sight. The camp rose early. There were no shouted orders, no panic, only movement. Precise, quiet, and practiced. Bundles were packed with furs, dried roots, tools. Meat was wrapped and cooled in leaves, pressed against stones to slow its warming. Children were instructed in soft voices. Stay near, carry this, walk when told. Aluna stood at the edge of the camp, scanning the treetops. The sun was rising, but dulled. Its light filtered through smoke until the sky wore the color of ash and old rust. Tia clung to her side, not with fear, but alertness. The child had always watched more than she spoke. Her small hand grasped the edge of Aluna's tunic as if tethering herself to something solid. Sally and Naru had not yet returned. By mid-morning, shadows stirred in the trees. A bird burst from the canopy, wings frantic, then vanished into the sky. Moments later, two figures emerged. Sally stepped first into the clearing, her face streaked with soot. Naru followed, limping slightly, a rip in his leggings revealing a gash across his shin. They didn't speak immediately. Aluna offered them water. Sally drank deeply, then passed the skin to Naru, who swallowed without pause. Only then did she speak. The fire is not near, she said, but it is wide. How wide? Asked the elder, her voice thin but strong. Sally squatted near the fire, her fingers digging into the earth, sketching a rough shape. It started beyond the red valley, dry trees. The wind has fed it for days. If the wind holds steady to the north, it will pass far from us. And if it turns? Sally looked up. Then it comes. A silence settled, as heavy as the smoke. Naru shifted, his face pale. We saw animal tracks heading east, herds moving, birds flying low. It's not just the fire, they feel something else. Aluna's jaw tightened. She looked at the old woman, whose eyes were closed, her head slightly tilted. 2 days, the elder whispered. We have 2. 2 before what? Someone asked. But she didn't answer. That afternoon, the decision was made. They would not wait for the fire to find them. They would leave before it could. The path would be hard, up through the ridge trail, where the ground turned steep and water was scarce. But it was safe, for now. The youngest children were paired with the strongest carriers. The old woman would ride in a sling supported between 2 poles. Mia, though limping, insisted on walking. I'll be slower, she said, but I'll walk. Aluna began preparing what they could not carry. Some tools were buried, hidden caches for a possible return. Firestones, bone knives, clay pots. She wrapped them in bark and mud, tucked beneath a wide rock. She showed Tia how she did it. These will sleep, she said, and one day we might wake them. Tia nodded solemnly. By the time the sun dipped again, the camp looked thinner, emptier. The fire was allowed to die low. They would not light it again that night. Smoke attracted notice, and they had enough of that in the air. That evening, they gathered one last time before the hearthstone. The old woman rose with difficulty, leaning on a staff. Her voice shook, but her eyes gleamed with something ancient and alive. When the earth moves beneath you, she said, you do not resist it. You walk with it. She looked at the children. When the birds rise, you rise too. When the wolves retreat, you follow their path. Then her gaze found Aluna. And when the fire speaks, you listen. No more words were needed. They ate a quiet meal, mostly roots, some dried berries, a sip of broth for each. No one spoke of tomorrow, not aloud, but they carried it in their backs, in their shoulders, in the quiet folding of their things. That night, Aluna lay beside her children, but she did not sleep. She stared into the dark where the trees were still but not calm. The wind shifted once, just briefly, and brought with it the first true breath of the blaze, a scent so sharp and dry it made her throat close. She sat up listening, eyes narrowing. Not yet, but close. She whispered a song without words, and the trees, barely rustling, seemed to hold their breath. Morning arrived without color. There was no sunrise, only a pale illumination that bled slowly into the sky like a bruise beneath skin. The smoke lay thick over the forest now, and the light passed through it muted and sickly. The camp stirred quietly, not with the rituals of routine, but with the burden of purpose. The fire was left cold. Each family packed what little they could carry: furs, tools, dried food. No one wasted motion. Even the children, usually slow to wake, moved with a quiet determination that belonged more to instinct than to teaching. Aluna knelt beside the hearthstone and placed her hand upon it. The surface was cool, blackened. Her fingers lingered there, not to warm, but to remember. This fire had fed them through cold moons. It had boiled herbs to ease births and bathed them in smoke after death. It had dried meat, lit stories, melted snow into water, and now it would be left behind. She rose without a word and joined the others. Mia stood with her weight on one leg, leaning slightly on a carved walking stick. Her face was drawn but determined. She had refused assistance beyond that stick. "If the wolves can limp and lead," she had said, "then so can I." Sally moved through the group like a shadow, checking bundles, whispering names, tightening knots. Her movements were lean and controlled. But when she passed Aluna, their eyes met, and in Sally's gaze was a flicker of concern. Not fear, just the knowledge of what it meant to lead others through uncertainty. The old woman had been secured in a litter, cushioned with furs and moss. Two men would carry her, trading places when needed. She held her carved antler across her chest like a sacred object, her eyes half closed. By the time they began their ascent up the ridge trail, the forest had begun to shift. Birdsong had vanished. The usual chorus of chirps and whistles had been replaced by a low rustling, constant, like whispers passing through every leaf. The wind no longer played. It pushed, urging them forward. The path narrowed quickly, forcing them into a single line. Naru led with a long branch used as a staff, his limp more pronounced now. Behind him came two others carrying water skins. Then the old woman, then Aluna, with Taya at her side and the baby wrapped tight against her chest. Mia walked near the rear, her stick tapping softly with each step. The climb was slow. The ridge trail was steep and gnarled with roots. Each step required balance, effort. The smoke had thickened, making breath short. But no one complained, not even the children. It was as if some shared knowledge passed between them, unspoken. To speak was to waste strength. Around midday, they paused near a rocky outcrop. From here, the forest spread wide below them, a sea of green and gray. In the distance, past the rise of hills, they saw it, the fire. It wasn't a line or a wall, it was a wave, a slow, undulating advance. Trees folded into it like straw, and behind the flames came smoke so thick it seemed to swallow the sky itself. The fire moved not with rage, but with hunger. Patient, inevitable. Tia gripped Aluna's hand tightly. "How far is it?" she whispered. "Far enough," Aluna said, "but not far enough to rest." They pressed on. The smoke began to sting the eyes. Ash drifted in thin spirals, settling into hair, onto shoulders. The forest was quiet now, unnervingly so. No rustle, no chirp, only their footsteps and the distant, constant sigh of wind through trees. They reached a plateau, a shallow rise ringed with large stones, likely once sacred to someone. Here they stopped. The old woman was lowered gently from the litter, her eyes opened fully for the first time that day. "Here," she said, "we wait here." Naru objected softly. "The fire." "It won't reach us tonight," she said firmly. Sally looked to Aluna, who nodded. They would trust the old ways, even now. A small fire was lit, just enough to boil water to warm the children. They dared not let it burn long. Meals were eaten cold, most with hands still smeared with ash. Water was shared sparingly. Tia sat close to Aluna, her face smudged, her hair wild. She had not spoken since the outcrop. The baby, too, was restless, turning in sleep and fussing without sound. Aluna reached into her satchel and pulled a small object, a shell pendant, smooth and pale. She pressed it into Tia's hand. "What's it for?" the girl asked. "To remind you," Aluna said, "that even fire ends." Tia looked at it, her eyes wide. "Will we go back to our cave?" "Maybe," Aluna said. "Maybe to a new one." They lay under the open sky, though the stars were hidden by haze. The smoke glowed faintly above them, lit from below by distant flames. And then somewhere in the valley behind them came a sound, a long, low crack, like a tree splitting in grief. Then another, closer. No one moved, no one needed to. The fire was still far, but it was coming. The night passed in a state of half-sleep, the kind where dreams hover just beyond the edge of awareness, and every creak of branch becomes a warning. The forest did not rest. Though the fire was still distant, its breath reached them. Warm winds, ash that settled like dust on their brows, and the occasional sound like distant thunder as a tree gave in to flame. Aluna did not sleep. She sat upright, a fur wrapped around her shoulders, her baby nestled against her chest. Taya lay beside her, curled tight, one hand still clutching the shell pendant. Across the fire's faint embers, Mia stirred, wincing once as she shifted her injured leg. Sally walked a slow perimeter around the camp, spear in hand, every few minutes casting her gaze back toward the smoky horizon. In the hours before dawn, the world held its breath. Then slowly, light returned, not bright or golden, but gray and grim. The sun was hidden, its rays filtered through a sky that had turned the color of old iron. The smoke had thickened, their throats ached, their eyes watered. It was time to move again. They broke camp with the silence of those who had been too long without answers. Water was divided again, precious and low. Food was handed out in strips. The old woman refused to ride in the litter now. She walked slowly, leaning heavily on a staff carved long ago by hands no longer living. They climbed higher along the ridge path, now narrowing into a trail barely wider than 2 footsteps. On one side, dense underbrush and ancient pines. On the other, a steep drop into the valley below. They walked in single file. Naru had taken the lead again, despite the pain in his leg. He muttered softly as he walked, something between a chant and a breath, his hand trailing across the bark of trees as if asking permission. Aluna walked behind Tia, watching every step the child took, ready to steady her if the path shifted or her foot slipped. The baby remained quiet, too quiet. She shifted in her wrap but made no noise. Aluna reached down, adjusted the cloth, felt the warm breath against her chest. Still there, still with her. The air grew hotter. Even without direct flame, the heat pressed in like a hand. The smoke no longer drifted, it surrounded. Their skin took on a sheen of ash and sweat. The younger children began to cough, their little bodies not yet strong enough to bear such air. They were moved to the center of the group, surrounded by those who could still breathe easier. By midday, they reached a split in the trail. One path curved downward into a ravine, promising water, shade, maybe shelter. The other continued upward toward open cliffs, exposed to wind and sky. Sally called for a stop. The group gathered under what little canopy remained. "The fire is pushing from the west," she said, her voice hoarse. "If the wind turns east, the upper trail will give us warning, but it offers no cover." "The ravine may trap us," Naru said, wiping ash from his eyes. "If the fire reaches it, we'll have no way out." Aluna looked toward the ravine, eyes narrowing. The air there seemed thicker, but cooler. She stepped a few paces toward it, crouched, pressed her palm against the ground. Still moist. She lifted a leaf. Damp. Not from dew. Too late for that. From the hidden stream beneath the rock, water ran below. "There's a spring in the ravine," she said. The old woman had been silent till then. She sat on a stone, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. Then she spoke softly. "Take the ravine." Sally frowned. "You're sure?" "It was once a riverbed," the elder murmured. "It remembers how to survive." That was enough. They descended into the ravine. The path twisted tightly, steep in some places, requiring hands as well as feet. The brush was thick, but not hostile. Trees arched above, and the light dimmed. The air turned cooler by degrees. The sound of trickling water began to echo faintly. It was like stepping into the memory of a safer time. The group moved slowly. Mia leaned on Sally now, the pain in her legs sharper with each step. Tia helped carry a small pack, the weight clearly too much, but she refused to hand it off. She was quiet, focused. growing before their eyes. By late afternoon, they reached the heart of the ravine. It was a wide, shaded hollow with stone walls rising like cliffs on either side. A spring bubbled up from beneath a shelf of slate, forming a shallow pool. The water was cold, clear, alive. They drank in silence, passing cups hand to hand. Even the baby suckled from a soaked cloth with a small, weak cry of relief. They bathed their faces, wiped soot from their skin. Mia soaked her bandages. The children laid on cool stone and stared up through the narrow canopy, where a sliver of the sky still showed. Aluna sat near the spring, her eyes closed, listening. The water sang. It flowed through cracks and roots, carving paths older than memory. It spoke of time, of cycles, of return. It promised nothing but presence. Then she heard it, far off but clear. The call of an animal, not a predator's growl, not a bird's cry. A howl, long, low, rising, a wolf. Aluna opened her eyes. The fire was not their only watcher. Something else moved beyond the ridge, and it too was coming. The howl echoed once more before fading into the folds of the ravine. It lingered on the air like smoke, not threatening, not close, but present. Aluna tilted her head slightly, her ear catching every nuance in the silence that followed. No rustling, no movement, just the subtle shifting of wind over stone and the persistent trickle of the spring. Tia, crouched near the water, looked up at her mother. "What was that?" she asked, voice hushed. Aluna did not answer right away. She dipped her fingers into the pool, letting the cold water run between them as she thought. "A reminder," she said finally. Tia nodded, though she didn't understand. Not yet. The others had heard it too. Sally stood with her back to the wall of the ravine, eyes scanning the rim above. Naru held a large stone in his palm like a weapon, though no threat had yet appeared. Even the old woman seemed more alert, her hands gripping her staff tighter than before. But no second howl came. By evening, the group had settled into the contours of the ravine. They chose their sleeping spots carefully, near the water, but with backs protected by stone. Fires were forbidden again. Smoke might curl upward, giving their position away. The heat in the air was no longer from the sun. It was something deeper, carried in on the breath of a slow approaching blaze. Aluna sat with Mia, tending to her wound under the shadow of a leaning boulder. The gash had stopped bleeding, but infection hovered like a bird above it, waiting for weakness. "We need to clean it again tomorrow," Aluna murmured, grinding a mix of dried leaves in her palm, "and boil these if we can." Mia gave her a sideways glance. "And if we can't?" Aluna didn't answer. The baby stirred in its wrap and began to fuss. Aluna lifted her gently, pressing her to her chest. The child was hot to the touch, not with fever, but from the heat that clung to everything now. She unwrapped part of the fur and let the cooler night air reach the baby's skin. A slow breath returned, then another. The child settled. Tia had found a smooth patch of rock and was drawing with a burnt stick, spirals, symbols, and crooked figures. Aluna watched her out of the corner of her eye, noting the order of her marks. "That one," Aluna said, pointing. "What does it mean?" Tia paused. "It's the wolf, the one we heard." "And that one?" "The fire. It's behind us." Aluna leaned in. "And these lines here?" Tia hesitated. "I don't know. I just drew them." Aluna nodded. Sometimes the hand remembers before the mind does. Later, as the sky deepened into night, a faint breeze stirred through the ravine. It carried with it a sharpness, not just from ash, but from cold. It was unexpected, a chill that didn't belong in the season. The kind of cold that moved through marrow and bone, not from weather, but from omen. The old woman called for them to gather. They circled around her, those who could walk easily and those who needed help. The children came too, pressed against their mother's sides, eyes wide. "I have seen this place before," the elder said. "Not with my eyes, with my sleep." She gestured to the walls of the ravine. "It is a place of echoes, a place where old things walk. Not just animals, not just fire, but memory." She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small bundle of feathers, bones, and dried herbs. With care, she scattered them on the ground, forming a shape, a circle crossed by a jagged line. "This is what we stand in," she said. "A split, a choice." Sally frowned. "You mean a danger?" "Not yet," the elder said. "A door." Naru leaned forward. "A door to what?" The old woman looked at Aluna. "You tell them," she said softly. Aluna felt the weight of the fire's gaze shift onto her, though it was not present. She inhaled slowly, searching for words that would not sound hollow. It means, she said, that not everything chasing us burns. A rustle passed through the group, more felt than heard. Some shifted, others lowered their eyes. Only Tia kept staring upward, toward the dark ledges that framed the sky above. That night, Aluna did not sleep. She sat with her back against the stone, her baby in her arms, and watched the rim of the ravine for shadows. And when the second howl came, fainter than before, yet unmistakably real, she did not flinch. She whispered beneath her breath. Not a prayer, not a warning, just a name, not yet remembered, but soon. The morning returned shrouded in silence. Even the birds, those that hadn't fled the smoke, refused to sing. The air lay heavy in the ravine, pressing down as if the sky itself had lowered. The usual rustle of leaves, the chatter of insects, the creaking of old branches gone. Only the persistent gurgle of the spring remained, carving its way through the stone, indifferent to everything above it. Aluna stood at the edge of the water, washing her hands slowly. Her fingers moved through the current with care, not for cleanliness, but for grounding. The coolness was the only familiar thing left in a world that had begun to shift. Behind her, the others stirred into slow movement. No one spoke loudly. Even the children whispered. The fire, though not yet visible, had changed them. Its presence, distant but inevitable, pressed upon their skin like invisible hands. They had begun to carry themselves differently, eyes scanning, steps lighter, breaths measured, every movement calculated as though each moment might be the last quiet one. Sally returned from the mouth of the ravine where she had kept watch through the early hours. She knelt beside Aluna and dipped her own hands into the spring. No change in the wind, she said. Aluna didn't answer. But something's coming. Sally looked over at her, waiting. Aluna met her gaze. Yes. From the far end of the hollow, Naru was fitting a new leather wrap around the head of a spear. His limp had worsened, but his hands were steady. Tia helped him, handing him twine, her small fingers tracing the notches in the shaft as if learning the language of the weapon. She no longer flinched at the talk of threat. Like the others, she had become quieter, older in the way children sometimes grow too fast when the world changes around them. The old woman sat beneath a crooked pine growing out from the wall of the ravine, her legs wrapped in a woven shawl, her eyes following the shadows across the stone. She had spoken little since the night before, but Aluna knew she was listening to more than voices, to rhythm, to movement, to the strange cadence of an ancient forest disrupted. Mia remained resting, her wound dressed again with ash and resin paste. The swelling had eased. She drank more now, her appetite returning, but her silence had deepened, and her eyes were always turned uphill toward the smoke they couldn't see but knew waited like a quiet hunter. By midday, the air grew warmer again, the smoke thicker. Shafts of sunlight reached down into the ravine only faintly, dulled by the soot-heavy sky. They knew this place would not protect them forever, but before they could plan their next move, they heard it. Not a howl, footsteps, faint, then clearer. The crunch of stone underfoot, a break of a twig. Someone or something was descending the trail behind them. Sally rose first, her hand already on her spear. She motioned for the others to stay low. Aluna passed the baby to Tia and stepped beside her. They moved silently to the outer edge of the ravine's mouth, where underbrush still covered part of the slope. The sound grew closer. Then a voice, a woman's. Not loud, not calling, just speaking steadily. Words not meant for them, but not hidden either. Sally raised a brow. Another clan, she mouthed. Aluna nodded once. They waited. Then, through the thicket, a figure emerged. She was tall, draped in a patchwork of furs and tanned hides, her arms lean and strong. Her hair was braided tightly to her scalp, and beads hung from her ears and neckline. Behind her came two others, a younger girl, perhaps Tia's age, and a man bearing a basket on his back. All were coated in soot and streaked with the grime of travel. They froze when they saw Sally and Aluna, weapons not yet drawn but ready. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the woman held up her hands, palms out, slow and calm. We're not lost, she said, but we've left everything. Aluna studied her face. You come from the east? She asked. The woman nodded. Beyond the hills, the fire is behind us. Took our trees, our huts, even the ground. It cracked like dry bone. Sally lowered her spear slightly. What do you seek? The woman looked at the spring, then at the people now visible behind the two sentries. A place to breathe, she said. Aluna glanced back at the ravine. They had little, but they had water, and for now, that made them strong. She stepped aside. Then drink. The three newcomers entered slowly, warily, but with gratitude etched into every motion. The girl knelt at the spring and cupped water into her mouth so quickly it spilled down her chin. The man dropped his basket and sat with a heavy sigh, his chest heaving. The woman remained standing, her eyes never still. She watched the trees, the cliff walls, even the faces of the children. "You heard the howls?" she asked quietly. Aluna nodded. "We did." "They've been following the fire," the woman said. "Not running, watching, like they're waiting." "For what?" Sally asked. The woman's gaze drifted back to the rim of the ravine. "For what burns last," she said. No one responded. That night, they shared what little food they had. The newcomers offered dried mushrooms and a strip of fish wrapped in leaf. In exchange, they received water, a space by the wall, and silence. Aluna sat with the baby in her arms, watching the stars reappear through the haze in thin silver streaks. The wolves were still out there, but now, so were others. Not enemies, not yet friends, just people who had also listened and also fled. The stars blinked into the sky like shy eyes peeking from behind smoke-tattered veils. They were fewer now, but each one seemed more deliberate, as though chosen by something unseen to bear witness to what lingered below. The ravine slept uneasily, some curled in tight groups, seeking warmth from one another rather than the night. Others, like Aluna, remained awake, not from fear, but from necessity. She sat beneath the sloped wall of stone, her baby pressed close, her ears tuned to every scrape of rock, every breath, every sigh of wind. The new arrivals slept close together under a stretched hide, their faces hidden. But even in slumber, they did not relax. Their muscles twitched, their limbs flinched. Ghosts of whatever they had seen still chased them. Tia slept on her side, one hand wrapped around the shell pendant, the other resting on her stomach. Her breath was steady, but shallow. Aluna reached over and laid a gentle palm on her back, feeling the warmth of life beneath her skin. That was enough for now. The wolves did not howl again that night. But something else filled the silence, an occasional knock of stone or a shifting of leaves where no wind passed. Once, a faint clicking, like teeth or claws tapping wood. It came from above the ravine, along the rim, and moved too fast to be human. By dawn, most had only slept in fragments. When the light returned, dim but steady, they began to prepare. The air felt tighter, as though they were breathing through cloth. The heat had crept in again, the kind that came not from sun but from distance measured in time, not space. The woman who had arrived last, her name, they learned, was Rima, rose early and began to mend a torn pouch with practiced fingers. Her daughter, Lyra, gathered water for the group without needing to be told. The man, Odrin, remained mostly silent, always watching the path they'd taken down. Sally approached Aluna as she adjusted the baby's wrap. "They trust no one," she said under her breath. Aluna nodded. "They've had reason not to." Sally's jaw tightened. "We've all had reason." Across the spring, the old woman was speaking softly to herself again, tracing lines in the dirt. The circles she had drawn before had changed. Where once they were round and unbroken, now they forked, split down the middle, like cracks in ice. Mia stirred nearby, sitting up slowly with a grimace. The swelling in her leg had receded, but stiffness still ruled her motion. She gestured for Tia to help her wrap the bandage anew, and the child obeyed without hesitation. "We can't stay here another night," Mia muttered, her voice thick from sleep and pain. "The trees are telling me." Aluna agreed. "We move today." But where? That question lay heavy among them. The ravine, once their haven, now felt like a bowl, protective only so long as the rim did not light with fire. Odrin finally spoke, his voice deep and rough like stone turned over. "There's a place east, past the dried river. The cliffs form a hollow, wide and flat, with stone roofs and water that collects in long pools." Sally raised an eyebrow. "And you're just now saying this?" "We weren't sure we'd reach anyone," he replied. "Didn't know if we'd be welcome." Aluna met his eyes. "You are now." Rima joined them, her tone matter of fact. "We came from that way. The path is harsh, open in some places. If the fire curves fast, it might outrun us. Or miss us entirely," said Mia from behind. The decision settled like ash. They would go. Preparations began quickly. Bundles were tightened, water skins filled, tools checked and counted. No fire was made. They ate raw roots and dried meat in silence. Before they left, the old woman called Aluna to her side. She held out her carved antler, weathered now, smooth from years of handling. "I won't carry this further," she said. "You will." Aluna reached forward, hesitant. "This is yours." "It was given to me when I became what I had to be," the elder replied. "Now it's your turn." Aluna took it, the weight surprising. It didn't feel heavy in her arms, but in her chest. "What am I becoming?" she asked. The old woman smiled softly. "The same thing I did, the one who remembers." They left as the sun began its slow ascent. The trail out of the ravine sloped sharply at first, then leveled into a narrow path carved through dry brush and stone. The group moved in silence, eyes always glancing toward the west. As they climbed higher, the view widened, and so did the fire. It stretched across the forest in a long, seething wave, red and black and gold, a moving wound carved into the earth. Birds circled above it, lost and confused. Small animals darted through the brush ahead of the flames, some collapsing mid-run. The children were told not to look. Most of them didn't need to be told. They walked all day, with few stops. The only water came from a cracked rock where a thin stream seeped out, barely enough to fill two skins. Every drop was shared. By evening, they reached the dried riverbed, long, winding, and ghostly. Stones littered its path like bones. Beyond it lay the cliffs that Odrin had spoken of, and something else. Smoke again, but not from the fire, from another camp. Tents, movement, people. Aluna stopped in her tracks, another clan, or what remained of one. She turned to Sali, to Rima, to the others who stood frozen behind her. "We don't know who they are," Sali said, her voice cautious. Aluna looked down at the carved antler in her hand, then up toward the rising dark, toward the faces of strangers also marked by soot, by fear, by fire. "We know enough," she said, and they stepped forward. They crossed the riverbed in silence. Their feet crunched against the brittle stones, some rounded by old currents, others sharp like fractured bone. Where once water had surged and danced in ancient rhythm, now only dust and memory remained. The sky above glowed a dim copper hue. Sunlight filtered through layers of smoke and exhaustion. The encampment on the far side was quiet, but not dead. It stirred like an animal conserving strength, watching. Shapes moved between lean-to shelters of bark and hide, some carrying bundles, others tending to shallow pits of coals that smoldered without flame. Their fires, like their eyes, were dimmed, intent on survival, not warmth. Aluna held the carved antler against her chest as they approached. It did not feel like an object anymore. It was a signal, a marker, a weight passed down through calloused hands and sleepless nights. Sali walked beside her, every muscle taut. Behind them, Rima and Odrin flanked the children, Tia keeping close to Mia as she walked carefully with her staff. The baby stirred once in Aluna's wrap, but did not cry. When they were halfway across the flat of the riverbed, a figure from the encampment stepped forward. He was tall, his skin weathered and pale beneath the layers of soot that masked his face. His hair had been shaved close to the scalp, perhaps from ritual or heat, and his eyes were sunken, but bright. In one hand he held a curved knife, not raised, but visible, a symbol more than a threat. Aluna stopped and lifted her free hand. "We have no claim," she said simply, "only breath left." The man looked past her to the dozen or so behind, each marked by fire and flight. Then he lowered the blade. "Then you've come the same way we did," he replied. Others emerged now, not many, perhaps 24 in total, mostly women and children, some elders, a handful of men. All bore the signs of motion, wrapped feet, dry lips, eyes that had stared too long into smoke. They parted without command, making space between the tents, opening the boundary of their small circle. "Come," the man said. "If you can walk, you belong." And just like that, the two paths met. As they entered the camp, there was no celebration, no cries, no rush of welcome, just nods, gestures, water passed hand to hand, a place to sit, a palm pressed briefly to a shoulder. This was how those who had fled learned to speak, without the need for words. Tia helped Mia settle near a low rock where she could prop her injured leg. A young boy from the camp brought her a pouch of cool clay, and she took it without ceremony, pressing it to the bandage. Rima and Lyra found an open patch of shade and laid down without removing their cloaks. Odrin crouched beside a group of other men, already speaking softly, comparing trails, burns, and loss. Aluna knelt near a cooking pit and poured water from her pouch into a clay vessel. She ground a few dried roots into a paste and stirred it slowly, feeling the rhythm steady her hands. The carved antler rested in her lap. Later, as dusk settled over the camp, the two groups gathered loosely near the center, seated in uneven rings. Some stared at the coals, others watched the sky, as if hoping for stars to pierce the veil of smoke. But none came. The man who had greeted them, his name was Hiran, stood beside a firestone. He turned to the people, his voice soft but sure. "The land is closing behind us," he said. "We cannot go back, but forward where? The fire has eaten the lowlands, and the mountains hold only stone and wind." Sali answered him, "We've come from the west ridge. There's no path left behind us, and the east is narrow, steep." Hiran nodded. "Then we are surrounded." Aluna stepped forward, the carved antler in her hand. All eyes turned. "There is still sky above," she said. "Still breath in our lungs. We are not surrounded. We are together." A murmur passed through the group, not loud but real. The first shared thought in days. An elder woman from Hiran's camp rose with help, her back bent, hair braided with beads blackened by soot. "When I was a girl," she said, "my mother spoke of a place far north, beyond the Black Hills, where the wind comes cool even in the warm moons, where water sings from stone and trees grow wide enough to sleep beneath." "Does it exist?" someone asked. "I don't know," she said, "but I'd rather walk toward a story than stay waiting in its ashes." Silence again. Then Rima stood. "North, then." Aluna looked at the carved antler. She traced the line of one etching, wavy, broken, mended again. "Yes," she whispered, "north." They would not rest long, only enough to drink, to sleep, to remember who they still were. Then they would move. Not because they knew the path, but because they were still walking. That night was different. Not quieter, not darker, but heavier. The weight of choices made and journeys begun pressed into every breath. Two clans now sat under the same ruined sky, their bodies gathered close, but their thoughts scattered like embers before a wind that would not stop blowing. Aluna did not sleep. She lay on her side, the baby curled in the crook of her arm, and listened to the overlapping patterns of unfamiliar breathing. New rhythms folded into the old like streams joining a river. Every cough, every shifting limb, every restless sigh was a reminder. They were more now, but not yet whole. She turned slightly and looked over at Tia, who had fallen asleep with her head on Mia's thigh. Mia was awake, eyes open to the haze, lips parted in silence. The old wound had drained again during the day's walk, and now it throbbed a dull, growing heat. "We won't make it north if it worsens," Mia whispered without turning. Aluna said nothing, but she reached for her pouch, pulled out a damp scrap of moss soaked in bark resin, and handed it over. Mia pressed it to her wound with a sigh. "I'll walk until I can't," she murmured. "And if I can't, you keep going." Aluna didn't respond. Instead, she reached for the carved antler beside her and ran her thumb on one of the deeper grooves. It hummed beneath her skin, not a sound, but a presence. A pulse older than her name. Near dawn, when the stars were just beginning to fade from view, a voice rose from the edge of camp. Not a cry, not a scream, a song, soft at first, low and steady, a lullaby. It was Lyra, Rima's daughter, alone, seated beside a pit of stone, rocking gently back and forth. Her voice was clear, unshaken by smoke or grief. She sang not to soothe, but to remember. The melody wrapped around the camp like a long-forgotten thread. Heads lifted, eyes blinked open, children sat up. Even the old woman from Hiran's group leaned forward, her hand pressed to her chest. No one spoke, no one dared. The words were not known to all, but the feeling was. The song told of a tree older than sky, of a stream that never ran dry, of a fire that could warm without burning. It was a map, not of places, but of belonging. When the final note faded into silence, the camp breathed again. It was a single breath, shared. Aluna stood. She walked to where Lyra sat, crouched beside her, and laid the carved antler between them. The girl looked down at it, her fingers hovering over the worn lines. "Do you know what this is?" Aluna asked gently. Lyra shook her head. "It's a story you carry," Aluna said, "even if it's not yours yet." The girl touched one of the grooves. "It feels like it remembers." It does. As the sun rose through the gray haze, the camp began to stir in full. There was little food, less water, but the decision had been made. They would head north, toward the story, the cold wind, the wide trees, toward something they could not see but needed to believe in. Before they departed, Hiran called for a marking. From his pouch, he pulled a small stone coated in dark pigment and knelt at the base of a flat slab near the center of camp. One by one, others followed. They pressed hands into ash, into soil, into dye, then onto the stone. Not names, not ownership, just presence. We were here. We lived. We moved. Taya pressed her palm gently onto the slab, her fingers trembling. She stood beside Lyra as they watched the prints gather like leaves on the face of a still pool. When all had left their mark, Aluna stepped forward last. She did not press her palm. Instead, she set the carved antler against the stone and leaned it upright. Let it be a root, a signal, a guide for those who might come after. Then, without turning back, they began their walk. The line of bodies stretched long and narrow, winding up the low slope beyond the riverbed, moving northward into land no one knew. The world behind them smoldered. The world ahead waited in silence, and still they walked. They moved as one long shadow across the land, a river of bodies drawn forward not by certainty, but by momentum, a kind of ancient gravity that clung to the soles of their feet and pulled them onward. The sun, though veiled, arced its way across the sky above them, a pale ghost of itself, casting only the suggestion of warmth. Beneath that thin light, the land unfurled in quiet desolation. Grass had turned brittle. Trees, when they appeared, stood half dead. Leaves curled inward, bark cracked from heat. What birds remained flew high and fast, their cries sharp, unnatural. The wind carried smoke in waves, sometimes thick enough to choke, sometimes vanishing altogether, but always there. Aluna kept to the middle of the column, close to Tia and Mia. The baby remained pressed against her chest, quieter now, but not in the way that brought comfort. She had grown too still, her little breaths shallow and slow. They walked through midday without pause. No shelter, no water, only the trail beneath their feet, worn paths, old animal tracks, the faint memory of migration from seasons before. Twice they found bone clusters, once from deer, once human. Neither were recent, but both were reminders. Behind her, Aluna could hear the footfalls of Rima and Odrin. The woman had spoken little since the song. Her eyes were distant now, turned constantly toward the north as though following something invisible. Ahead of them, Sali led the front group with Hiran. They walked without words, but with shared purpose. Each turn in the trail, each ridge or rise, they chose carefully. Mia's steps were slower. Her wound ached, though she never said it aloud. She gritted her teeth each time she had to climb a slope. Taya stayed near, offering a hand, carrying a pouch when needed. The girl had shed the weight of childhood in the days since they left the cave. Her eyes no longer flicked toward her mother for guidance. She simply watched, and moved, and did. They stopped briefly when the sun began to lower. Just enough time to drink from the last remaining skins and chew dried root. No fire, no song, just breath and grit. Aluna sat beside Mia and poured the last of their water into a shallow wooden cup. Mia passed it to Tia first. The girl took one careful sip, then gave it back. Mia drank second, Aluna last. When the cup was empty, they passed it to another family. No words exchanged. The act itself was enough. As night approached, they found a narrow outcrop beneath a line of scorched pines. The ground was uneven, but offered some cover. The trees were blackened at their base, scarred but standing. Above them, stars returned, fewer than before, and only briefly, before the wind pushed more smoke across the sky. They made camp in silence. Aluna lay the baby on a thin mat of woven reed and fur. She checked her breathing again. It was there, still shallow, still soft, but there. Sally approached with a bundle of crushed leaves. For the baby, she said. Chew them. Let her suck. Aluna took the bundle. Thank you. Sally sat beside her, brushing ash from her knees. Tomorrow we'll reach the foothills, she said. Odrin says the cliffs curve into a basin. If we're lucky, there's water caught there. From last rains, maybe. Aluna looked up at the darkened trees. If we're not lucky? Sally didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a strip of leather from her pouch and began threading small bones onto it. Tiny pieces carved from fish spine, shaped into beads. Aluna watched her hands work. I used to make things like that, she said softly. Sally nodded. Before all this? No, Aluna said. During. They sat without speaking for a long while, the only sound the soft crackle of dry grass shifting beneath restless feet. Across the camp, others were doing the same, resting without sleeping, waiting without hope or fear, just waiting. Before dawn, Aluna rose. She walked away from the camp, just far enough to be alone, but close enough to hear if the baby stirred. She knelt at the edge of a flat stone and closed her eyes. She did not speak, she just breathed. And in that breath she tried to remember the names of those she had lost. Not only to fire, but to time, to forgetting. To the slow unraveling of memory that happened when you spent too long surviving and not enough living. She opened her eyes and looked toward the east, where the first pale thread of light was beginning to stretch across the horizon. And then she whispered, one name, then another, and another, and the wind carried them away. The light returned in shades of ash and rose. It came not with clarity, but with uncertainty, diffused through a sky still veiled in haze, its colors warped by the fine particulates of burned forest. Yet it was morning all the same. The soft hum of movement rose within the makeshift camp. Cloth rustled, skin brushed against stone, and the quiet murmurs of rising breath replaced the stillness of the night. Aluna sat watching her baby stir, the child's tiny fingers curling slowly around a fold of fur. The color had begun to return to her cheeks, subtle, like the faint blush of morning. She had taken the leaf chew the night before, her lips latching on instinct, and now her breaths came deeper, steadier. Aluna placed a hand over her chest and closed her eyes. A moment, just one. Then the day began again. Mia was already awake, biting down on a strip of dried meat, her jaw clenched with determination. She didn't speak as Tia helped her up, but her nod was firm. The girl moved with a quiet rhythm, tightening pouches, folding wraps, binding her own hair with sinew. Sally had risen early and gathered those strong enough to scout the slope ahead. From the edge of the encampment, she gestured upward, toward the line where the blackened trees ended and stone began. Odrin stood beside her, holding a curved stick with a knotted leather sling. Past that ridge, he said, there's a cut in the cliffs. If the old basin still holds, we'll see it by midday. Huron joined them. Then we climb. The words settled into the camp like a breath held too long. Climb. No one spoke against it. They packed quickly. Rima bound a stretch of bark into sandals for her daughter, whose feet had blistered 2 days before. Naru fashioned new straps from twisted vines. The old woman, Huron's elder, tied a braid into her hair and rubbed charcoal beneath her eyes, a mark of travel or protection. No one asked. The meanings of such gestures had long outgrown language. Aluna lifted the baby back into her wrap and took her place within the middle ranks. She moved without thought now. Each step, each preparation, lived inside her bones. As they began the ascent, the ground turned brittle. The soil shifted easily beneath foot, turning every slope into a test. They climbed in long silence, heads down, hands steady. Loose rocks slid beneath them, and every few paces someone stumbled, but none fell far. Each time a hand reached out, quiet, steady, unwavering. They climbed not as individuals, but as a woven mass. The cliffs rose higher with each hour. The blackened trees gave way to scrub and rock, to twisted bushes clinging to life in the cracks. Sparse tufts of grass still grew here, yellowed but living. The air, though thinner, grew cleaner. With every breath, the smoke thinned just slightly. Taya climbed close to the front now, her legs strong from days of movement. She did not ask for help. She did not need it. When they reached the top of the third ridge, the wind hit them in full, cold, real. It swept across their skin like memory, something they had not felt in so long it startled them. It carried no smoke, no scent of char, just air, true and sharp and high. They stopped. Ahead of them, the basin unfurled, wide and sunken, a cradle of stone framed by cliffs. And in the center, glinting like the eye of some slumbering god, was water. Still, whole, untouched. A gasp moved through the group, not a sound of fear or joy, but relief so deep it emptied lungs. They stood without speaking, the image imprinting itself into every mind. Aluna stepped forward and dropped to her knees. She pressed her hand to the earth, then to her heart. It was real. They began the descent carefully. The path was easier now, the slope gentler. They reached the edge of the basin by late afternoon. The water was shallow in places, deeper in others, pooled from springs tucked beneath the cliff walls. Moss grew around its edges, and trees, real trees, bore fruit the size of closed fists. Children ran to the water first, stumbling with laughter that sounded foreign at first, then familiar. Some fell to their knees and drank directly. Others scooped water into skins, hands, mouths. Mia sat beside a stone and wept openly. Taya leaned into her, holding her tightly. Sally knelt and began to scrub the ash from her arms. Rima laid her daughter in the grass and sang a single low note, holding it until her voice broke. Aluna walked to the water, dipped both hands in, and poured it over her head. Cold, pure, alive. Then she removed the carved antler from her satchel and placed it gently beside a flat stone. She ran her finger along its edge and whispered, "You brought us here." As the sun dipped below the edge of the cliffs, light filled the basin with fireless gold. The camp settled into stillness, not from weariness, but peace. They had found something not promised, not prophesied, only needed. And in that quiet, with water lapping against stone and the wind brushing the tall grass in slow waves, Aluna sang. Not a song of mourning, but a song of thanks. That night, for the first time in many days, they lit a fire. Not out of desperation, but choice. A small one, built with care, tucked beside the basin's southern wall, its light gentle and unthreatening. The wood was dry but clean, collected from scattered fallen limbs beyond the cliffs. It cracked softly, a warm, living sound that curled through the camp like a breath returning to a long-stilled body. The flames didn't roar. They pulsed. They listened. People gathered close, drawn not only by the warmth but by the presence of the thing itself. Fire, this old powerful companion, had chased them, threatened them, driven them to the edge of the world. And now it stood again beside them, not as a destroyer, but as an ancient memory, tamed, trusted once more. Aluna sat closest to it, her baby sleeping quietly against her chest, one hand tucked beneath a fur wrap. Taya leaned against her side, eyes reflecting the flicker of the flame like twin mirrors. Around them, others settled in, some with food, some with silence, some with stories half-formed on their tongues. Mia lay stretched on her side, her leg propped on a smooth stone. She watched with heavy eyes, her hand wrapped loosely around a cup of warm broth. Her pain had not disappeared, but it no longer dictated the shape of her every movement. Sally sat opposite the fire, sharpening a thin blade with a stone. The steady, rhythmic hiss of metal against mineral added its own voice to the gathering, soft, persistent, alive. After a time, Hiran stood. He lifted his hands, not high, not commanding, but simply enough to draw the circle's gaze. "There is no tale tonight of battle," he said. "No story of cleverness, no warning, no boast. There is only this." He stepped forward, knelt, and touched the ground. "We were not meant to make it," he whispered. And then, as if the act itself were a ritual, he placed a stone beside the fire. Smooth, oval, white, not marked, not sacred, just true. Rima followed, saying nothing, only laying her hand upon his shoulder before placing a second stone beside his. Then Lyra, then Odrin. One by one, others joined. Children brought pebbles, elders brought bones smoothed by time. Sally placed a shard of flint from her satchel, worn at the edges from long use. Tia chose a piece of charred bark she had carried since the cave. And Aluna? She placed nothing. She simply sat, watching the stones grow into a quiet mound of proof, a shrine of presence. Each piece a voice, a breath, a moment of persistence made tangible. When it was done, they said nothing. They just sat. The fire burned low. The night turned cooler, brushing skin with the memory of coming cold. But no one moved to leave. They remained by the flame, as people had done for thousands of nights before, and would do again long after the memory of this one faded. Eventually, the old woman from Huron's group, silent for many days, began to hum. It was barely sound at first, a vibration in the throat. But then it grew, a melody built not from words, but from shape and pattern. She sang of rivers, of long walks, of earth that cracked and healed and cracked again. Others joined her, one by one, low voices, untrained, human, and the fire pulsed with them. Even the stars came out then, peeking one by one through the thinning smoke. The sky stretched above the basin, clear and endless. The moon, swollen and glowing pale, rose like a witness. That night, no one stood watch. They trusted the cliffs. They trusted the cold wind. They trusted the flame. And deep into the night, as dreams returned to those who had long gone without, Aluna whispered to her sleeping child, "You'll remember this place." Then she rested, and for the first time in many days she dreamed. Morning rose gently, without alarm, without urgency. There was no smoke on the wind, no trembling ground, no frantic whisper threading from one sleeping form to another, only the soft hush of a cool breeze moving through tall grasses and the quiet chorus of birdsong, clear and hesitant, as though the birds themselves were just learning to trust the sky again. Aluna awoke slowly, her body heavy with rest instead of tension. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her limbs did not ache from half sleep and her dreams had not ended in fire. The baby still slept soundly, arms splayed and breath deep. Tia was already up, crouched near the edge of the basin with Lyra, both of them scooping water into smooth bowls carved from bark. The sight made Aluna smile. Not wide, not bright, but real. Nearby, Mia was propped up on her elbow, watching the girls. Her legs, still bound, looked less swollen, the angry color in the wound fading. Someone had tucked a bundle of herbs beneath her head during the night. She didn't know who, but it didn't matter. Kindness didn't need to introduce itself. Sally passed by with a satchel of foraged roots, her movements quiet but brisk. Her face bore no smile, but her steps were lighter, no longer burdened by the edge of the next unknown. She nodded to Aluna in passing. No words, just a knowing glance, the kind passed between those who had survived something together. By mid-morning, the camp stirred into motion. Not to flee, not to endure, but to live. Hiran organized a group to explore the basin's edges, searching for stronger wood, unspoiled stone, game trails. Rima led a handful of younger women and children to forage among the bushes that curled between rocks along the cliff base. Others cleaned tools, mended wraps, organized what food remained. Aluna joined Mia under the shade of a narrow tree whose leaves curled in the shape of small cups. She helped her sister unwrap the bandage, gently peeling it away. The wound looked better, still red, still tender, but healing. The edges had closed. The herbs had done their work. Mia winced, then exhaled. Doesn't feel like fire anymore, she murmured. Aluna crushed a few leaves between her fingers and dabbed the thick green sap onto the wound. No, more like rain waiting to fall. Mia looked out across the basin, where Tia and Lyra now chased each other along the water's edge. She's forgetting it already, she said, her voice low. Not forgetting, Aluna said, just carrying it differently. Later that day, the scouts returned with news. A grove beyond the far cliff where fruit trees still stood, their branches heavy with late-season yield. A shallow spring that trickled down from stone, clean and cold. Evidence of deer, hoof prints, droppings, bark rubbed raw, and caves. Small but dry, sheltered, a place to stay, not forever, but long enough. That evening they built more fires, small, spaced apart, safe. Children brought sticks and fed them with giggles. Old songs were hummed, not loud, not celebratory, but woven through with something unfamiliar, hope. Aluna sat near the fire again, her baby cradled in one arm. Tia sat beside her, brushing strands of grass into simple chords. Her hands moved instinctively, her fingers remembering something she had seen her mother do. Across the fire, Rima was teaching Lyra to tie a net. Mia leaned against a log, chewing slowly on roasted root. Her eyes watched the sky. And Sally, she sat alone on a rock, staring northward, beyond the cliffs, beyond the basin, not in fear, not in longing, just watching. As the sun dipped low, casting everything in deep gold, Hiran approached Aluna. In his hands, he held something wrapped in bark and leather cord. This was found in the grove, he said, offering it. She took it gently, unwrapping the layers until she revealed what lay within, a small carved figure, worn, smoothed by years of handling. A woman, bent slightly forward, arms outstretched as if holding something unseen. I've seen these before, Aluna said, her voice soft. In our old camp, Hiran said. One sat above the fire. We called her the Keeper. Aluna turned the figure over in her hands. It was warm from the sun, its face simple but certain. She waits, she said. For what? For us to become who we already are. That night, as the fires flickered and the stars returned in full, Aluna placed the carved figure beside the stone where the antler had rested the night before. Not as a shrine, not as a warning, but as a beginning. And the basin, silent, wide, breathing, held the sound of it all. In the days that followed, the basin began to shift, not in earth or weather, but in presence. It no longer felt like a place found in fear. It began to feel like something built, gently, cautiously, through the smallest of motions. Sally organized a hunting group that returned with 2 small deer, their hides smooth and their bones rich with marrow. The kill was quick, clean, honored with silence and shared labor. The meat was divided equally, nothing wasted. The children helped carry the limbs back to camp, their fingers sticky with blood, their eyes wide but not afraid, only watching, learning. Rima and Odrin fashioned racks for drying meat using saplings and sinew. Each time they tied a knot, they whispered something beneath their breath, short phrases that meant little to others but were familiar to their hands. Perhaps names, perhaps thanks. No one asked. Hiram oversaw the clearing of the grove. The fruit trees were carefully harvested, with the ripest left in small piles at the edge of the woods, an offering, a habit, or maybe a message to the land that they remembered how to give as well as take. Mia sat in the shade and stitched, her legs still stiff, but her hands alive. She wove reed mats with a young boy from Hiram's group, teaching him the fold and pull pattern their grandmother once used. He worked slowly at first, but soon the rhythm found him. By nightfall, he had made a mat of his own. Tia, meanwhile, had found a new ritual. Each morning, just as the light broke, she walked to the flat stone where the antler and the carved figure now rested. She sat beside them and listened, not to words, but to the wind, the trees, the water. Once, Aluna joined her and asked what she heard. Tia had smiled faintly and said, "Everything that hasn't been said yet." Aluna kept that answer close. She had begun collecting stones. Not large ones, just those that called to her hand as she walked. Smooth, pitted, sharp-edged, warm, cold. Each had a texture, a memory, a story not yet written. She placed them in a shallow bowl beside her sleeping place. Some nights she arranged them into shapes. Spirals, arrows, cradles. She didn't know why, but it helped. The baby grew stronger. Her eyes opened wider now, following the flicker of firelight and the movement of hands. She reached toward faces, toward the sky, toward the sound of her mother's voice. When she laughed for the first time, short, sudden, like the pop of dried bark in flame, it startled everyone nearby. They all stopped, then smiled, even Sally. One afternoon, the old woman who had journeyed with Hiram called for the others. Her back was bent, her hair streaked with white and soot, but her voice rang clear. She stood before the basin's shallow edge, where the water lapped lazily against stone. In her hand she held a bundle of herbs and feather. Around her the people gathered. "We mark this place," she said, "not as an end, not as a hiding, but as a breath." She dipped the bundle into the water, lifted it toward the sky, then pressed it gently to the earth. Then she looked to Aluna. "You've carried many things," she said. Aluna stepped forward. "This land remembers," the elder continued, "and so must we." Aluna knelt and placed both palms into the water. The chill ran up her arms and into her chest. She closed her eyes and listened. She felt the quiet hum beneath the surface, the slow echo of time folding in on itself, the way the land received her touch without resistance. She whispered nothing. There was no need. When she stood, she did not wipe her hands dry. Later that night, the basin came alive with sound. Not chaos, not fear, laughter. Voices rose around fires, sharing memories, weaving new ones. Someone played a flute carved from bone, its melody soft and unsteady, but beautiful in its imperfection. A child clapped in time. Another followed. Tia danced, slowly at first, then with more certainty. She moved in wide, sweeping arcs, her feet bare, her arms outstretched like branches. Lyra joined her, then others, until half the camp spun in quiet joy, as if shaking off layers of ash too long carried. Aluna watched from a distance, her heart full and strange. She sat with the carved figure in her lap, tracing its form in the firelight. Her thumb brushed over the smooth arc of its back. It felt lighter now. She looked toward the basin, toward the cliffs, toward the sky. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, not about what lay behind, but what could lie ahead. The season shifted without announcement. It came not in a sudden gust or a clear change in light, but in the quiet accumulation of small moments, the way the mornings grew crisper, how the fruit on the trees began to soften and fall before being picked, the increasing number of birds overhead, not fleeing but passing through. The basin responded gently. Shadows stretched longer along the cliffs. The water cooled. Mornings came wrapped in thin mist, and at night the fires burned a little brighter, a little longer, though never as high as before, always respectful, always careful. Aluna rose earlier now, before the sun. She liked to walk the edge of the basin while the others slept, her baby swaddled and quiet against her chest. She traced the curve of the land, the softness of moss underfoot, the brittle snap of the occasional dry branch. Her breath came out in pale clouds, each one fading quickly into gray-blue morning. She would pause sometimes near the stone where the antler rested, and the figure, the keeper, stood watch. It had become more than a symbol now. It was a gathering place, a landmark, a hearthstone of spirit. People had begun leaving things there. Small feathers, bits of polished wood, fragments of bone carved with marks only the giver understood. A tooth from a long-gone dog, a woven braid, a single strand of red thread. One morning, Taya placed a small doll there, made from reeds and grass, tied with string and dotted with ochre. She didn't explain. Aluna didn't ask. But she noticed how the child sat taller that day, how her silence held something full instead of something heavy. By then, the camp had grown into more than survival. It had taken on shape, intention. Shelters had been rebuilt and lined with thickened bark and hide. Storage pits were dug, filled with drying roots and meat, sealed with ash and covered in leaves. A rhythm emerged, not fast, not rigid, but present. Mornings for water and foraging, midday for craft and teaching, evenings for food, for stories, for the low hum of voice and flame. Mia had taken to teaching the children how to dye bark using boiled moss and iron-rich soil. Her leg remained stiff, but she walked more now, leaning less on her stick. She smiled more too. Half smiles, yes, but real ones. Her voice carried when she spoke to the children, and they listened with open eyes. Sally had grown quieter again, not with distance, but with focus. She spent her days mapping the surrounding cliffs, marking trees, reading soil. She returned each evening with something new, a new trail, a scent on the wind, a change in the moss's direction. She said little, but her eyes were steady, and the firelight reflected something calm in them now. Rima planted seeds. It was not something anyone expected, least of all herself. But one morning she began. She found a patch of soil on the basin's edge, dark and soft from old floods. She pressed her fingers deep and made rows. Then she opened a small pouch she had carried since her home was lost. In it were seeds wrapped in dried leaf, grains, herbs, a few not even she remembered by name. She buried them with care. Even if they don't grow, she told Aluna, they'll remember how. Aluna nodded. That's enough. The children had begun their own games too. No longer shadowing the adults with anxious eyes, they now formed packs, ran paths, created rituals of their own. One game involved racing around the basin's edge with a smooth stone passed between them. Another, more serious, involved tracing patterns on each other's backs with ash and guessing the mark. Once, Aluna watched Tia draw a long spiral on Lyra's shoulder. Lyra guessed wrong, and they both burst into laughter so full, so deep, that it startled nearby birds into flight. The basin echoed with sound again, laughter, song, hammering, chopping, the splash of water, the grind of stone, the murmur of shared stories. It was not loud, not constant, but it was steady, and underneath it all a sense of something forming, not just a place, not just safety, a home. One afternoon, Aluna stood at the edge of the basin with the baby in her arms, watching clouds gather over the cliffs. The air felt thicker. A shift was coming. Not fire this time. Something else. Perhaps rain. The wind stirred the grass. The baby reached toward it, fingers splayed as though trying to catch the invisible. Haran approached, his face smudged with soil from a morning of digging. We've been talking, he said. Aluna turned. About? Name. She raised an eyebrow. For the basin, he said. If we are to stay, if this place is to hold us, it should know who it holds. Aluna looked out again at the wide bowl of earth, at the trees bending low with fruit, at the children dipping their feet into the water, at the lines drawn into stone, at the smoke curling from cook fires, at the sky above. And she smiled. Let the children name it, she said. That evening they did. One by one, the youngest walked to the fire, whispered their choice to the elders. Some offered nonsense syllables. Some spoke names of long-gone animals. One child simply said, here. By night's end, it was decided. Not one word, but a shape, a spiral, drawn in the dirt, in the firelight, with many hands. No one tried to pronounce it. They simply accepted it, and in that shared silence, the basin finally had a name. The rain arrived with no warning. Not a drizzle, not a mist, but a full, soaking curtain that fell from the sky as if the clouds had been holding their breath for too long and could no longer contain themselves. It poured in great waves, drenching earth and skin and stone. The sound filled the basin like a river, like a voice too ancient to name. At first, they were startled. Tools dropped, fire pits hissed, children shrieked and ran beneath crude shelter frames. But then slowly, the panic faded. One by one, people emerged again, lifting their faces to the sky. Aluna stood barefoot in the grass, her baby tucked beneath a wrap at her chest, the fabric quickly soaked through. The child squirmed and let out a squeal, not of fear, but of confusion, of delight. Her small hands reached upward, as if to grasp the falling sky. Mia hobbled into the rain with a fur draped over her shoulders, her leg dragging slightly behind her. She opened her arms wide, eyes closed. Her braid hung heavy, plastered against her back. Tia and Lyra danced in slow circles, letting the water streak their faces, drawing it down their cheeks with soot-blackened fingers, mixing it into something new. They ran toward the basin's edge and dipped their hands into the already rising pool, laughing, shouting, singing fragments of old songs. Rima stood at the grove's boundary, her hands pressed to the wet earth where she had planted her seeds. She did not move, did not speak. She only waited, her breath in time with the falling rain. Hiran and Odrin moved quickly to protect their drying racks, lashing new bark coverings over the meat strips, securing everything with vines and stone. The others followed suit, not frantic, not afraid, just practiced. Movements honed by the memory of loss. Sally paced the basin's edge, watching how the water flowed, where it pooled, where it threatened to gather too quickly. She marked the soil with lines of char, her fingers soaked in black. Each mark meant something: danger, safety, overflow, passage. A new map written in the language of water. The rain continued into nightfall. They made no fires. The wood was wet, the air too thick. Instead, they huddled together in groups beneath shelters and tree limbs, their bodies pressed close, warmth shared through contact rather than flame. Someone began to hum, soft and low. Then another voice joined, then another. A lullaby grew from the wet darkness, not one of sorrow, but of survival, of cycles. When the morning came, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The clouds remained low, like an animal curled against the basin's rim, not ready to leave, but no longer growling. Everything glistened, the leaves, the grass, the tools, even the stones looked polished, like they had been turned in a river for centuries. Water pooled in the center of the basin, deeper now, wide enough for children to splash through up to their knees. The carved figure, the keeper, stood firm, droplets trailing down its smooth back like tears. Aluna knelt before it and pressed her forehead to the wet earth. It was cold, fragrant with loam and moss, and the minerals that lay buried for so long beneath fire's shadow. Tia joined her. Together they ran their hands through the pooled water, stirring up little whirlpools, tracing spirals in the mud. "This rain," Tia said. "It's like a song." Aluna nodded. "One we almost forgot." By midday, the basin was alive again. They dug new trenches, reinforced shelters, collected water in every hollow they could find. The earth was generous now, but they moved with care, not wasteful, not loud, just present. Every action meant something. Mia sat beneath a canopy and retold stories to the children, of before the fire, before even the cave, of ancestors who sang to stars and named trees by their songs. The little ones listened with wide eyes, the older ones nodding slowly, taking in more than just words. Sally marked a new boundary at the edge of the basin. Not a wall, a path, a direction for when they would one day leave. Because even here, even now, there was the knowledge that nothing stayed still forever. But for the first time, there was no rush, no fleeing, only a growing sense that they could go someday, not because they had to, but because they chose to. That evening, as the rain faded to mist, Aluna stood at the highest point of the basin's rim. The wind curled around her, soft and cool. Behind her, the camp glowed dimly in the silver light, voices rising in laughter and song. Ahead, the land stretched into folds of green and gray, the world reshaped by flame and water alike. She placed one hand on the carved antler tucked into her belt. Then she turned back toward the basin, toward her people, toward what was growing. And she smiled, not because it was easy, but because it was becoming. By the next full moon, the basin no longer felt temporary. Paths had been worn into the soil, between shelters, to the grove, along the ridge, down to the water's edge. The grass flattened beneath repeated footfalls, then rose again, stronger. The scent of smoke from cooking fires no longer felt like a warning. It mingled now with roasted roots, dried herbs, and the soft sweetness of simmered berries. Children played freely, not just near the center of camp, but at its borders. They returned at dusk, coated in dust, carrying stones and stories. They no longer asked permission to explore. They simply looked over their shoulders, met the steady gaze of an elder, and nodded. A silent contract. I go, I return. Tia had become one of the quiet leaders among them, not by command, but by presence. She taught younger ones how to braid grass cords, how to read wind ripples on water, how to spot a safe place to rest. She no longer looked to Aluna for approval. She looked to her only to share what she had found. That, Aluna thought, was its own kind of growing. The baby had begun crawling, slow at first like a wave testing a shoreline, but soon with purpose. She followed sound, she followed light, she followed Tia most of all. Aluna spent more time near the grove now, not alone, never alone, but with those who remembered. She joined Rima in tending the shallow rows, their hands pressing gently into damp soil, their voices low. They didn't need to speak about the seeds anymore. They simply checked for sprouting. Green tips had begun to appear, small but defiant, life inching upward. It's enough, Rima whispered once, cradling a new shoot between thumb and forefinger. It's a beginning, Aluna replied. Sally had expanded the map. She now led short journeys beyond the basin every third morning, scouting, noting, tracing patterns in the rock with blackened charcoal. Each return brought news. A stream that trickled beyond the northern rise, a cave that opened into hollow silence, a bird's nest high in a tree that bloomed despite the smoke. She said little, but she shared each finding by placing a mark on a growing diagram they etched into the inside wall of a low shelter. We'll need more than one home, she said once. The world moves, even when we don't. And they listened. One evening, after the rain returned for only a few hours, and the soil steamed softly beneath their bare feet, Hiran brought a bowl of polished stones to the fire. He passed them out to the children, one by one. Each child received two, one dark, one pale. They were told to keep the pale stone as a marker of where they were now. And the dark one? To leave behind, he said, in the place you wish to return to. Some children dropped them at the base of the keeper's statue. Others placed them near their shelters. A few carried them for days, unsure. Tia placed hers beside a tree she had claimed as her own, near the spot where she had first seen Lyra laugh. She pressed it gently into the earth. I'll know where I grew, she said. The moon rose full and white that night, framed by the cliffs like a watchful eye. The people gathered around the central fire, though no one had called for it. They came as though summoned by something deeper than sound. Mia began the song. It was slow, broken at first, her voice raspy from days of disuse, but she carried it forward with determination, and soon others joined. Sally's voice followed, then Hiran's, low and grounding. Then the children, half humming, half guessing, but eager. The song was new and old. It told of wind and ash and water, of walking, of naming, of the space between fear and home. There were no verses, no chorus, only the rise and fall of shared memory. Aluna did not sing. She held the baby against her and closed her eyes, letting the melody pass through her like breath. The child stirred and pressed her cheek against Aluna's chest. Tia sat beside her, arms crossed over her knees, chin resting on them. She hummed softly in time. When the fire dimmed and the last note faded, no one spoke. They simply stayed, wrapped in the silence that follows meaning. Before the embers cooled, the elder woman, Hiran's mother, who now walked only with help, rose slowly. She held a stick carved with spiral grooves, newly added, freshly burned. She pointed to the map shelter. Add it, she said, and so they did. The basin was no longer a stop between dangers. It was part of the journey, a mark on the long spiral, a point on the fireless map. The first frost came without warning. It whispered in under the cover of night, slipping between the fibers of woven mats, curling over stones, glinting on the water's edge before the sun even dared rise. Thin sheets of ice clung to the surface of the basin pool, cracked with the weight of morning breath. Grass stiffened and crackled underfoot. A new stillness settled into the air. Something sharp, something ancient. When Aluna stepped from her shelter that morning, the world felt paused. She stood barefoot for a long moment, letting the cold bite into her skin, not to suffer it, but to feel it fully. The baby stirred on her back, shifting in the thick fur wrap, lips puckered against the sudden chill. Tia emerged next, arms crossed, her breath clouding in soft white puffs. Her eyes widened when she saw the frost. Is it winter already? She asked. Aluna shook her head. Just its first breath. Across the camp, others were waking to the same discovery. Some groaned softly, Others laughed. Short, surprised bursts that drifted up like birds startled into flight. The elders nodded, as though recognizing an old visitor. Sally stepped from her tent, wrapped in a heavy hide, and scanned the ridge with narrowed eyes. "This will change how we move," she said, mostly to herself, and it did. That day, preparations began. Mia organized the younger children to gather dry grasses and firmer branches for insulation. With her leg healing, she moved more freely now, directing with quiet authority. Her fingers, stiff but capable, demonstrated the weave of tighter mats, layers pressed with packed moss. Tia worked at her side, quick to imitate, quicker to teach others. The shelters were thickened, furs were restitched, food stores were checked, counted, moved to deeper pits. Odrin showed a group how to smoke fish with low-burning coals beneath half-buried stone, heat-trapped, moisture drawn out. Rima oversaw the grove, covering the most delicate sprouts with bark shrouds. Some would not survive. She accepted this with a slow nod. Aluna and Sally walked the basin together, marking new paths for cold weather windbreaks, looking for signs of pooling water that would freeze and turn footing dangerous. They barely spoke. Their silence was easy now, full of shared knowing. That evening, the fire burned higher, for warmth, for light, for something more. A story was told by Hiran this time, one of his own mother, long before any of them had walked together. A tale of cold moons, of a mountain cave sealed in ice, of a child who learned to breathe with her face pressed against stone. His voice was steady, worn smooth by memory. No flourishes, no exaggeration, just truth. When he finished, no one clapped, no one cheered. They simply leaned closer to the flame. The frost returned that night, thicker. It crept farther into the grove, kissed the corners of the shelters, dusted the dark top of the keeper's head with glittering silver. The carved antler beside it turned slick with a fine glaze. But no one feared it. They had prepared. In the early light of the next morning, Aluna found herself walking once more along the basin's rim, alone. The grass crackled beneath her feet. The cold was sharper now, enough to sting the lungs, but the air was clear, so clear. The kind of cold that stripped everything unnecessary from the senses and left only the essential. From this height, the basin stretched below her, quiet, full of motion and rest at once. Smoke curled from a few shelters. Children were just beginning to stir. Tia carried a bundle of dry sticks in her arms, already anticipating the day. Sally stood at the grove's edge, inspecting the path of the rising sun. Rima knelt over a mound, uncovering the sprouts beneath with care. Aluna turned her face into the wind and closed her eyes. She thought of the cave, the fire, the walk, the ravine, the strangers, the wolves, the spiral drawn in ash. She thought of hands, so many hands, holding, lifting, making, of silence that taught, of stories that chose their own time to return. She opened her eyes. Down below, the baby had begun to cry, just once, short but strong. And like a signal, the day began again, with fire, with frost, with feet on cold earth, with a song not yet sung but felt, becoming more, still becoming. The snow came softly, like sleep. It arrived on a wind so calm that no one noticed at first, not until the flakes began catching in hair, resting on lashes, gathering on the dark shoulders of hides. Children reached for it in wonder. It melted in their palms. The elders turned their faces upward and whispered small things, names, prayers, the kind of quiet talk reserved for what returns only when it is ready. It had been many moons since snow had touched them. Fire had taken so much, but snow was different. It came not as warning, but as a hush, a stilling, a cover drawn over the land to remind it, rest now. Aluna stood at the basin's edge, her baby warm against her back, wrapped in layered furs that smelled of smoke and pine. Tia stood beside her, arms outstretched, catching snow with the kind of joy only the unshaken still knew. "It's gentle," she said. Aluna nodded, "for now." And it was. The flakes drifted slow and steady, blanketing the grove, the stone ledges, the paths they'd made. Within an hour, the basin glowed with pale light. Sound shifted, muffled, round. Footfalls became whispers. Voices dropped without meaning to. Inside the shelters, fires were kept low. The smoke rose straight, clean, barely curling. Mats were hung tighter. The old woman, Hiran's mother, tucked herself near the heat and pressed stones to warm against her chest. Mia brewed bark tea. Sally took count of wood piles, rearranged bundles, measured days and strands of dried grass tied with knots. No one panicked. They had seen worse. They had walked through worse. Now, they simply adjusted. In the middle of the basin near the keeper and the carved antler, someone, no one knew who, began to build something. It began with a ring of stones, then branches, then long grasses woven and bent, tucked between bark and snow. Children added to it, small shells, bones, smooth wood, carved feathers. It wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a tool. It wasn't needed. And yet it was. A place. A marker. A way of saying, we're still here. They called it the circle. No one told them to. They just did. That evening, as the snow deepened and the firelight danced orange across white ground, Aluna sat at the edge of the circle and began to speak. Not loudly, not for all, but for whoever would listen. She told of the first cave, of scraping hide beside her daughter, of the first time Taya's hands learned the rhythm of work, of Mia's wound, of the ravine and the wolves, of smoke on the wind and names spoken into the dark. One by one, others joined her. Sally spoke next, of a hill that had never stopped burning, of a path she walked alone, of what it felt like to find water when she had forgotten the shape of her own breath. Then Rima, then Odrin, then Hiran, and then the children. Their stories were different. They told of spirals and dolls and games and the sound of water hitting stone, of the bird with the red throat that had returned that morning, of a dream one of them had, where the snow whispered secrets if you laid your ear to the ground long enough. No one laughed, no one corrected. The stories were not for history, they were for being. By the time the moon rose full and round above the cliffs, the circle was full. Voices quieted, the fire softened, snow continued to fall. Aluna cradled her baby, now asleep. Tia leaned against her side, drowsy but smiling, her fingertips dusted with ash, and for a long while no one moved. Then Aluna looked at the circle, at the bones, the shells, the hands that had placed them. She thought of everything they had become, not just to survive, but to grow, to teach, to listen, to remember. And she whispered, not to anyone in particular, not even aloud, "This is what we did all day." And the snow fell, and the spiral held,